So, how's it going, everybody? You can probably see from behind me, this is a Australian evening version of the 7 Minute Business Club. The reason is that I've got Stephen McGown here, who's currently in South Africa, Steve, correct?
That's right, Brian. Yes,
What
that's right.
part?
In Johannesburg. In Johannesburg.
Okay, great. So, I wanted to make it a somewhat sociable hour for you, an early evening for me in Australia. Hey, welcome to the 7 Minute Business Club.
Thanks for having me.
No,
Fantastic to chat to Australia.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I listen, as you know, I know your story, but what I want to do in the first segment, we're going to do something a little bit unusual in the 7 Minute Business Club today. So rather than hook straight into some of the takeaways and the lessons and the experiences you have, I think it's really good for our audience to get a sense of who you are. And if I can use the word journey rather than ordeal, because I think ordeal perhaps denotes a negative, and I'm going to call it journey because it's neutral in that wording, and just get a sense of what your journey was and how it all happened. And then people will have a sense of that. And then we're going to be really cruel. We're going to be like one of those 1980s sitcom dramas. We're going to leave it all in suspense for a week. And then in a week's time, we will be coming back with some of the takeaways and some of the lessons that us business leaders can get from what you've been through. Is that okay? You ready to go?
Fantastic. Let's do this.
All right, great. So you... And an adventurous soul, I believe you'd done Kilimanjaro and you'd done a few other things, and you decided to go to Timbuktu and get a motorbike and learn all about Africa. What happened next?
Yeah. So no, I mean, I've always been an outdoors kind of guy. In fact, one of our businesses here in SA is farming. So I always wanted to ride a bike through Africa. And like you say, I was in Timbuktu and I was busy living my experience, and it was absolutely amazing. And I was traveling with some other guys, and I was in Timbuktu. I'd been there literally, I think, 10 hours. And a bunch of terrorists, a bunch of Al-Qaeda members, soldiers, walked into our little auberge, the yard of our auberge. They came in with AK-47s, and they frog marched us out into the street. The streets were empty. Everybody was in mosque, and they loaded us up. We were handcuffed, loaded up. And I was taken out into the Sahara for the next 5 years, 8 months. And I was always held incredibly far away. You know, I didn't see a road for literally my 5 years, 8 months. I saw my first road on my release. I didn't see a cell phone tower. I literally had sand dunes, camels, and just dunes to the horizon, every direction from me. It was a bit of an insane experience.
Wow.
I was there.
This was late 2011, is that right?
That's correct. I was kidnapped on the 25th of November, 2011. It was a Friday, 3 p.m.
Yeah. Okay. It's a date you'll never forget, right?
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No. I was going to say, I mean, it's quite insane because every year that goes by since my release, I've only been out the desert now about 2 3/4 years. You know, I'm coming up to my third year out the desert, so it's all pretty fresh at the moment. And these are quite funny dates. You know, the date I was kidnapped, the date I was released, they become new birthdays or Christmases. They're quite an important day in our lives now.
Yeah. What a great point. It's almost like a rebirth. So what had you done previous, Steve? What were you up to before you went to Timbuktu?
So, I used to work in banking here in South Africa. I was at a few banks. I worked at Investec here in South Africa, and then I went to the UK. And in UK, I worked for some of the large American banks, Bank of America, JP Morgan. I worked for Royal Bank of Scotland while I was up there as well. So I was always involved in an accounting kind of job, project management kind of role within the banking sector.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, some might say slightly, as an ex-banker of old, slightly ill-equipped for 5.5 years in the desert with terrorists, I'd suggest.
You know, I was quite fortunate. Our family business is in fact farming. So from being basically sort of knee high, I was always knee deep in mud and in the dam and playing with horses and chickens and things like that. So I've always enjoyed the outdoors. And I think similar to living in Australia, living in South Africa is a very outdoor lifestyle. And I think it sort of equipped me quite well for certain things that took place in the desert. I think it equipped me better than it actually equipped probably my 2 fellow hostages who were from Sweden and from Holland.
Okay, so
I was in a better place, yeah.
Yeah. So all 3 of you were kidnapped. Did you know each other prior? Were you fellow travelers, or you just happened to be in the wrong place at the same time?
Yeah, no, we met actually up in Rabat in Morocco at the Malian embassy while we were getting our visas. And there was a whole row of people. There were Polish and French and Belgium, a whole row of people lining up to get their visas. And we were next to each other and everything was in French. So we started chatting about what do you put into what block, because my French is terrible. And we had a similar agenda. So we decided that we would actually play a bit of catch up. And it just sort of works out that, tourists, we had a similar thing. So we hung out. We didn't necessarily get along, but we had a similar agenda. So the conversations aren't too heavy or too deep. So as a veneer goes, everybody gets along really well.
Yeah, sure.
So we met about a month before the kidnapping.
So as I said, I almost felt it was respectful to our audience to split your story into two sections. One was explanatory and then one was takeaways and lessons learned and experiences shared. But just to delve a little bit deep into the latter just for a minute, can you talk us through, and this is really, really hard to wrap 5.5, if ever I've asked an unfair thing of one of our guests, is to wrap 5 years and 8 months into 7 minutes or a slightly more. But how would you describe, if you were to give me a summary of what the 5 years and 8 months felt like or looked like, how would you describe it?
It was long, to state the obvious. But I tell you, it was out of control and I was alone. And there were times I was so desperate for human attention, so desperate for information, so desperate to speak to my family. I didn't talk to my family for the full period there in the desert. Absolute fear for what happens when you get sick. Fear for being beheaded. I mean, the videos that you see about Qaeda hostages is generally somebody getting beheaded with a great big knife. And a lot of guilt for my family back home and what I'd left them with, not that I ever intended to get kidnapped. And it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. And as time went by, it felt like it was never going to end. It felt like I was going to get old, end up with my walking stick and end up dying at the age of 75. And I was kidnapped at 36 years old and I was held till I was 42 years old.
Yeah, right.
It was desperate.
Yeah. And then 5 years and 8 months, we could talk about this again and again, right? Because I'm just enthralled and really interested in the story. But 5 years and 8 months, how? Because from the outside looking in, statistically, your odds aren't very good if you're taken into an area like that in a situation like that to get out. So, do you feel like you bet the odds in getting out? And then how did it happen?
Without a doubt, I tell you, I was being looked after. Without a doubt. I don't know, there are not too many British, people who get kidnapped, because I've got a British passport as well. And they found my British passport. There are not too many British people that get kidnapped and get released. And funnily enough, I'm actually the longest held Al-Qaeda hostage in the world. Ta-da.
Yeah.
5 years, 8 months. I'm the longest held surviving Al-Qaeda hostage in the world. And I think my friends did not expect me to come out. My family did not expect me to come out. I think nobody really expected me to come out, including myself. I spent my entire 5 years, 8 months marketing the fact that I was born in South Africa and was South African. And my family were doing the same from this side. It was the biggest mind game to try and get through this situation. Sorry, Ryan, your question there.
How did the release come about?
Yeah, so the release was a bit of an insane situation. It was actually a bit of an anticlimax. I was in fact smuggled out of Mali at the end. I was wrapped up in full Arab gear that you could literally barely see my eyes. I had a very slitty thing over my eyes with my arm armor, as they call it, with the turban. And I was handed between a number of vehicles. I was being held on the northwestern side of Mali. A lot of driving, a lot of punctures, a huge sandstorm, and I changed vehicles about 3 or 4 times. And eventually I was handed across from Al-Qaeda across to a rebel group, another pro-governmental rebel group, but they too had their Kalashnikovs in their cars. So I still thought I was in captivity. And I was handed from them across to the Malian government. And I was then taken down to a safe house. But this was all completely behind the South African government's back and behind the French's back. And I was told by Al-Qaeda that there are obviously many military roadblocks between where I was being held in the desert, which was in the middle of nowhere. The further south I went, the closer I actually got down to the towns and the parts that were being protected by the French forces. There obviously was a greater military presence. And then we started getting to military roadblocks. And I was just told, sit in the back, don't speak to anybody. I was in a RAV4, funnily enough, and I actually had tinted windows, and I had two Tuaregs driving in the passenger seat, and they basically had their windows open. I had mine closed. Guys would stick their head in the window, the military, look at the back, look at me. They couldn't recognize me as being a white person, as being somebody who was non-Arab. And they didn't ask me questions. They asked the driver. The driver answered, and we went through. But I was told I couldn't speak to anybody until we arrived in the capital, which was Bamako, down in the southern side of Mali. And I was smuggled out. I was smuggled out of the desert. And there was a private jet waiting for me. I climbed onto that. I met members of the South African government. And then I flew back to Joburg. And it was a whirlwind. And to be honest, my memory is actually pretty terrible. Those first few months after my release was absolute chaos. I suppose there was a bit of PTSD, just being overwhelmed by journalists, overwhelmed by government, secret services, the whole bang shoot. That a lot of things I have to turn to my wife and say, what really happened? I actually can't remember what happened. It was quite a crazy time, I suppose, in my life and my family's life, to say the least.
Yeah, well, we can't imagine, but I can understand why that would. To me, that sounds very plausible. That would be the case. Well, Steve, I think that's a really incredible introduction, and I think it's going to give people a real sense of the adversity that you faced. And as I said to you before we started, one of the things I truly believe in as someone who's made leadership consulting a passion of theirs is we've so much to learn from people who've been through something that has nothing to do with business or nothing to do what we do as business leaders day to day. And I think sometimes we can learn more from people like that who through really authentic adversity in life that gives us great takeaways, great experience, and great strength as leaders to get through a crisis that in comparison will pale into insignificance, but still nonetheless is some lessons we can learn. So I think next week, what I'd love to do is tap a little bit more into some parts of that. It's going to take all my discipline to try and keep it to close to 7 minutes because there's loads in there. I can't wait to interview you to get to it. Would you be up for that?
100%. Fantastic. That'd be great.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Excellent. Now, spoiler alert, we will stick, because I always will, we will stick Steve's website just there right now. Learn a bit, if you want, learn more about the story, absolutely, and see what Steve's doing nowadays. But I don't think, I hope you won't be able to find some of the stuff that we will get into next week, which will make it unique content and value-adding content. Steve, thanks a million for agreeing to do this. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we'll talk to you next week.
Absolute pleasure. I look forward to it. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.